Hello. All right, so I'm just gonna flip to the title slide. And I will get started at 3 o'clock. All right, so it's 3 o'clock. I'm gonna get started. For all of you who are watching right now, or maybe you'll stumble upon this later, my name is Tang. I'm really excited that you're here for this Mad PD session. And so for the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to be chatting about something I've done in my classroom for the last few years, financial literacy and the real game. And then there will be some time for questions at the end if any of them come up. All right, so today what we'll just walk through what the real game looked like in my grade 7 classroom, as well as tying it into some financial literacy resources that my colleagues and I created this year. And so you'll see just some of the things we'll talk about here. So yes, to introduce myself a little bit more, currently I'm a grade 7-8 guidance teacher, but most of my experience has been in teaching grade 7 in an integrated arts program. When I was in grade 7, I remember my teacher, her name was Mrs. Targonsky, she did something with us called the real game, where we got to pick our own jobs and simulate adult life with it. It really stuck with me. I sought it out for my own students when I started teaching in grade 7 because I just really remembered it. And so I ended up with this binder um, with a facilitator's guide, and there were CDs with a whole bunch of different PDFs and stuff like that. Um, and that's sort of where I started. I'm always striving to make things relevant for my students and connected in some way to the broader community. So this was a perfect fit, while allowing me to tackle some of my curriculum expectations as well. So the real game is actually it's I think run through career cruising now. It's an online game, but what it is in essence is a role playing game in which each student plays an adult character. They are randomly assigned a job that reflects a wide cross section of contemporary occupations in Canada, and then they then experience a variety of scenarios and challenges and opportunities that a typical adult would have to face. So some things include, time management. They do budgeting, coping with job loss, exploring leisure activities, including planning a trip. And so the hope is really that by playing the real game, students will be exposed to a wide variety of occupations. They'll be able to discover for themselves the importance of a good education and lifelong learning. And also, they'll be able to practice critical skills like management and prioritization. So, the real game was my starting point, but as I've done it with my students, I've added some different elements. I often start it close to the beginning of the year, and I'll send home a letter to parents to explain the real game and what we'll be doing so that they can actually have this conversation with their kids at home. I taught in an integrated arts program, and so we had a block of time every 5-day cycle called integrated literacy, and that's often when we would do the real game during. It would be during that time. Every year, it really varied in terms of what it looked like and how long we spent with it. But in this session today, it gives an overview of some of the different things that we did. And then in terms of assessment, it provided lots of opportunity to practice both math and literacy skills. But when it came to evaluation, it was predominantly around literacy, specifically oral communication and media literacy. And so I'll kind of go through the different stages. The first stage is based on some of the pathways planning inquiry questions in the Creating Pathways to Success document. I ask the students to describe themselves and who they want to become. We also talk a bit about the world of work, and I gauge what their grasp is around things like net pay and gross income, jobs versus occupations versus careers, um, and also just their opinions about lifelong learning. This is a really great thing at the start of the year to help me get to know my students and their aspirations. And we usually represent their responses graphically or visually in some way too. And so I always end that first section by asking students what they wonder about becoming an adult. And you can see here, these are some of their responses. You can see that some of them are wondering, there were a lot about money, about work, um, a lot of things in there. How do you sign your children up for school? How can I be a good mother and a good wife? It's about balance. And I'm really amazed by how thoughtful some of my kids are, but also just how much is weighing on them when it comes to future planning. So I think the real game really helps students to ask and investigate some of the questions that they wouldn't have an opportunity to look at otherwise. And so stage two is where we introduce money and costs. When I did financial literacy this year, as part of my role as a grade 7-8 guidance teacher, we started with a Price is Right type Kahoot to see if students could guess how much typical things cost. Things like a 4-liter bag of milk, rent for a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, an iPhone. And I found this really jump started our conversation around money and the value of a dollar. So in stage one, it usually comes out that all adults need some sort of housing and transportation. So we start with this fun thing called a wish list, where there's no budget and they get to choose what they would want for their dream life. And so you can see here 2 pages. These are the first 2 of 4 pages of their wish list. On the left, they have housing options, so rent and mortgage costs, which I actually pulled from MLS listings. Um, And then on the right, you'll see the transportation options. The third and fourth pages are actually focused more on leisure. So they have leisure items that they can choose that have most of the time a cost associated with them, and then also leisure activities, which they can assign a certain number of hours per month to. We also talk about whether this wish list reflects what their life looks like now, and then we tally up their monthly costs just from their wish list, and we do a human number line activity to see where people landed. It's really important for students to wrestle with whether something is a need or a want. So we explore all the things that they think their family spends money on. They determine whether it is a need or a want, and we talk about how personal preference, priorities, and other things impact what people choose to buy or spend money on. So when it comes to wishes and dreaming, my students have lots of ideas around what they would buy if they were to live on their own. And so, something that we do is this little simulation. I give my students IKEA catalogs. I ask them to buy furniture for their first apartment. And this year, we actually did a $500 shopping spree using the Canadian Tire Wow guides for their apartment. And it's fun because they get a little shopping list, they write down everything that they want. They quickly realize how expensive it can be to furnish a house, but it's a great way to see what their priorities are. And this year, we do something at the end where we tell them they get to the checkout and they actually only have $300, so they have to go back and revise that list. And it just shows them that they really have to prioritize what is a need versus what is a want, when you only have so much money to work with. All right, so stage three, this is where we start to get into the nitty gritty, where we look at what sorts of occupations people want, how much people actually make, and what it takes for people to get there. When I first did the real game, I had pre-made job profiles that I randomly assigned to students. Um, and so when I do a truncated version of this, where the focus is predominantly on financial literacy, then I'll provide them with cards that have an occupation. It has education information, a description, and also what the salary is. But typically for my longer term units, I have moved to actually having the kids find this information out for themselves. That way, they're a bit more invested as it's an occupation they actually want. And the occupations that the students choose for this portion will be the one they are assigned for the simulation. So something that we use in Limestone is an online tool called My Blueprint, and we spend some time exploring occupations in there. It is a great tool for pathways planning and has a wealth of information, including what a job's work environment is like, what their tasks are, outlook, salary, required skills, and educational pathways. We use this information to create the job profiles for each student. And then we also use the salaries to determine each student's monthly income, what their deductions are, and also their net pay. In the past, I've had students create business cards, so it's an opportunity to tie this into media and branding and graphic design. We'll look at some examples and talk about, elements that we like from these different cards and what really catches people's eye and what sort of you're conveying to your customers through your business card. And then we'll do a speed meet, which is like speed dating, where they have to introduce themselves and their occupations to each other. And it's a great way to get in some oral communication practice. All right, so this last section is often what will take the longest, where we really dig into some money management. And so we start with getting a sense of what banks students know about, and then they do a bit of research to find out about some specific checking accounts at different banks. I usually have 8 banks that I'll create a little organizer for, and then students will work in groups to compare details for 2 banks. The students then choose what bank they will go with. And most of the time, my students opted for PC Financial, probably because they liked the no fee option and the things they wanted to do weren't particularly complicated. A few of them did go with larger banks like CIBC or BMO, but mostly the reason was because their parents bank with them and they said they already have an account there. So at this point, students will have chosen an occupation and a bank, and we work together to determine what their monthly income will be. And this is what we use to start the budgeting process. We'll do some pre-teaching around what a budget is, where it's used, and why. So in the past, I had students budget by hand or on Google Sheets. Um, And then we also kept a running bank book, adding things at different times of the year, such as Christmas gifts. But this year we used my Blueprints budgeting tool, which is really great because it provides a visual income or a visual for the students. So they just have to add their income, and there's lots of different categories of income, and then they also add each of their expenses. And the balance shifts with every entry, so it's real time. And you can see sort of at the bottom, it breaks down their expenses in terms of category. So you can see, is it housing that's costing the most, transportation? You can also see that for this example, the student did not leave very much money at the end there. $59 is not a big buffer. And yeah. And so again, I used to have students create their budget from scratch, going back to their wish list and finding something that's more viable. But it can be very daunting to have that much choice. And so something we did this year was actually provide different categories and then some options within those categories. So we started with looking at savings, and we gave them the option to save $25, $50, $100, or $250. And then we looked at housing, where they could either live with their parents at home, rent with a roommate, rent by themselves, or own their own home. Here you see the food options. So they have basic groceries, average, organic, and gourmet for 1 month. Transportation, they were able to do public transit, a used car, a new car, or a luxury car. And then there's a whole bunch of extras as well, like giving to charity and eating out, personal care, medication, entertainment. And so it made it a lot easier for students to be able to just choose the option within those particular categories. And so once students are finished with their budgets, they've had a chance to compare, I'll throw them a curveball. They'll all roll some dice, and depending on what number they get, something will happen to them. So maybe they worked overtime and made some extra money, or maybe their car broke down and they have a big expense to deal with. And this is really crucial because rarely do our budgets balance exactly the way we expect. So we can have students continue to do their budget monthly, and then have some new chance scenarios each month. And that will help them also. We can also have the conversation around, well, you were hit with a big expense this month. How are you going to change next month's spending in order to account for that? We also spend some time looking at the difference between credit cards and debit cards. The Kingston Community Credit Union has a great playlist on YouTube called It's a Money Thing, with just these short videos about tons of different financial concepts. And so I use the one where they compare credit, debit, and prepaid debit cards and the pros and cons of each. And I'll also show my students what a credit card statement looks like and teach them how to find different things on it. We look at a mobile banking simulator because kids are often asking, well, how do I actually pay bills? And we also explore interest rates, from credit card interest rates to things like Money Mart, Cash Money. And then they can see how easy it is for someone to fall into debt. So on top of budgeting their money, we also talk about budgeting time, and we create pie charts of how their weekly time is divided. And last but not least, this is something that we can continue, throughout the year. And some of the extensions we've done in the past are doing some trip planning. We look at job loss and then having them write resumes. And then also something I like to do is have them watch an episode or part of an episode of Till Death Do Us Part, because then they see someone in a scenario where they have a lot of debt. So it makes it a little bit more real for them. With the trip planning, the students get together with some other people and plan a trip, complete with an itinerary, a budget, and they also create a little promotional video for their destination of choice. And so I found it's easiest to do this on Google Sheets so students can work together. But here's a template of what their trip planning portfolio usually will look like. I'll make a copy for each group. And one of my students also started using Google My Maps. And so she showed the rest of the class how to incorporate that into organizing a trip as well. And so when we look at job loss, we also look at what happens when someone needs to apply for a job. And so this is where we come back to them personally and not so much their hypothetical dream job. Something I've done this year is use my blueprint to help students create resumes. We start off with looking at what sorts of skills they have, what experiences experiences they've participated in, be it extracurriculars, work, or volunteering. And then we use a tool in my blueprint to help them draft their resume. I'll actually interview them and give them some feedback on their communication and just their overall presentation. And this year, our guidance team actually created some fake job postings so that students could be a bit more pointed with their resume and they could choose a job that would be a good fit for them. And so here's just one more time the overview of the different things that we explore in my adapted version of the real game. And this is some of my contact information. I'm happy to take any questions. And also, if you'd like to get in touch with me, I am on Twitter at edgyscribblings, and my email is there, Tang Catherine at limestone.on.ca. All right. And so I'm just going to flip this back now. All right. And so I'm just taking a look and seeing if there are any questions. And it doesn't look like it. So I guess I will end it here. Hopefully, this was informative for you. And yeah, please feel free to get in touch with me if something comes up and you have a question or you want a copy of some of the materials that I use. All right. Thanks a lot. And thanks for watching.